So I originally wanted to do a review of this movie as a full review with me and Huck this year, but one, I had a bit of trouble getting the footage for it, and two, well, people expect me to do something else for Halloween every year, and I felt it best not to rock the boat. But I still want to review this movie anyway, so let's talk about it. Chuck Steele, Night of the Trampires, a stop-motion action comedy that technically was released in 2018, but it was a small release in film festivals, but it got a general release in 2021. Many of you probably haven't heard of this movie, which is a real shame because it was a really good movie, but it was an independently made stop-motion movie which had a lot of money put into its production, and as a result, when they were finished, they didn't have anything left for promotion. No posters, no trailers, not even on YouTube. So other than a few social media posts, there was nothing to make people aware this movie even existed. So it just kind of came and went and nobody even really noticed. Which is a shame because they really missed out. The movie is created and written by Mike Mort, who is another name that you may not be that familiar with, but for those in the know, he is a legend in stop-motion filmmaking. He originally made the series Gogs, that stop-motion series about cavemen, which you may or may not have heard of. It definitely had a little bit of a following, and it was a very well-made series. Wasn't quite as famous as anything Aardman would make, but it definitely had a bit of a following. After that, he kind of disappeared into the fold for a little bit and just kind of became another member of the stop-motion circle, working on other projects where he didn't really get as much of a name value. But a few years ago, he returned with a new short film, Chuck Steele, Raging Balls of Steel Justice, which actually was a really good short, and it got a premiere on Channel 4, and evidently this gave him enough gumption to do his own full-length feature based on the character, which is what this movie is. So the plot of the movie is that Chuck Steele, the, as he puts it, maverick, renegade, cop on the edge who doesn't play by the rules, is basically your stereotypical loose cannon cop, as he said, in LA in 1986. But there's something coming along that even he can't prepare for, as he has to take down the supernatural threat of the Trampires, a mix between vampires and tramps, or hobos if you will. And he has to team up with Dr. Abraham Van Rentel to take down the motherfuckers. So this movie's basically a spoof of 80s action movies, particularly Lethal Weapon, which I think they were a little bit late on that, I will admit, because the whole idea of referencing or spoofing the 80s, that kind of died out by the time the movie came out. It wasn't quite as big as it was in the late 2000s, early 2010s. The 80s is still very popular, but we're definitely more into the late 90s, early 2000s with the nostalgia craze now. But people do still like the 80s, so even if it was outside of the ideal release window for it, I still think it was a good idea, and it was done unbelievably well. This movie is not trying to be very clever, witty, or change the world with its writing. It's just trying to be a fun, silly, entertaining 80s action movie spoof with some supernatural elements and some amazingly well done animation. And for the most part, it pulls that off perfectly. It did get a little bit of flack from the critics in terms of how this movie was such a silly, stupid plot and very dumb jokes, had an incredibly ambitious production put behind it. But me personally, I thought it was brilliant in its own silly way. The humor actually reminds me a lot of South Park, just not as intelligent, but still just as funny. It's definitely one of those movies where it's aware that it's dumb, but it's having fun with it. Kind of like how the Nostalgia Critic put it with the Austin Powers movie, where it's the kind of dumb that has a little bit of a mind to it. Though I'd actually say this movie is a little bit more clever than Austin Powers, because at the very least this one knows that it's stupid. With the Austin Powers movies, you couldn't tell if they knew they were stupid or they were trying to be super clever and just failing. This one, you definitely get the idea that the filmmakers know that this whole thing is silly and they're just having fun with it. As a result, the movie basically takes every opportunity it can with this premise and just does whatever the hell it wants with it, and it definitely has a fun time, and we in turn have fun with it. And the one thing that really helps hold it all together are the characters, who are incredibly funny. And while they are mostly pastiches, they do have a little bit more depth to them than just cardboard cutout spoof characters. And it starts, of course, with our title character, Chuck Steele. Despite the movie being a spoof of Lethal Weapon, he's more of a spoof of a kind of character that Arnold Schwarzenegger would play, just sans the accent. He's incredibly brash, abrasive, super confident in himself, and just doesn't give a shit about anybody and is willing to do whatever it takes to get the job done. Though, to be honest, most of the time it doesn't even seem like he wants to do it because he wants to keep the streets clean, he just wants to cause destruction. We've seen these sorts of characters before. In fact, in many ways it's very similar to the kind of things you would see in the McBain sketches in The Simpsons, just stretched out to an hour and a half. But he does have more depth than McBain has, as he does have some issues, he does go through other emotions, and at the same time, even though he is mostly the badass hero, not everything goes his way. He does sometimes mess things up, and they do have a good balance of him being a cool badass and a dumbass very well. It's very similar to the kind of character that Bruce Campbell would play, and it really works. And even then, with the whole thing of him being a badass and him obsessed with trying to constantly keep up his self-image, actually comes into a clever bit with his own character development when it reveals why he's constantly like that, which is both very clever and very funny. The person I initially saw this movie with said that he reminded her of Johnny Bravo, and yeah, I can kind of see that, not just in the design, but that same kind of element of how he is so confident in himself that he doesn't see his own flaws, or just the fact that other people hate him so much. He's not as much of a buffoon as Johnny Bravo is, but he definitely has that feel about him. It's also worth noting that not only does Mike Mort write and direct this movie, he also voices most of the main characters, including Steele himself, who does an amazing job giving him that very stereotypical 80s gruff badass voice. But he's also really good at having some of those little subtle nuances in there that also make him really funny. He also voices Steele's commanding officer, Captain Jack Shit, who is more or less the kind of spoof of Danny Glover's sort of character from Lethal Weapon, as well as kind of a spoof of blaxploitation characters. And he does the voice really well for him too. Admittedly, the whole kind of ongoing joke about Jack and how he's trying to become a transvestite is a little bit awkward, but it doesn't seem too mean-spirited, and it is actually a little bit funny every once in a while. And he also does the voice of Abraham Van Rentel, who is kind of a spoof of Peter Cushing-style Van Helsing sort of figures that you would see in old Hammer movies. Just a little bit more older, feeble, and a tiny bit senile. And it really works. It definitely gets across the idea that he knows what he's talking about, and he's also a really good exposition giver. But at the same time, you can tell that he's not in his prime anymore, so he does make a lot of mistakes. And he does work really well as a comedy foil. And it makes sense to team him up with Steele, who is like the ultimate machismo cartoon figure, and a guy who's rather feeble and not in his prime anymore, but knows what he's talking about and takes things carefully. So it's actually a really good comedy foil body dynamic. Mort also does the voice of Detective Mahoney, who is a more minor, just very comedic character, not much to say about him, but again, he does a really good job in voicing him, and I'm really impressed because Mike Mort's skill as a voice actor is really impressive. He may have been using some post-production voice editing techniques to make his voice sound different for each character, but even then, I couldn't tell it was the same person doing all these characters, so bravo to him. Beyond him though, there's only two other actors who have any kind of name recognition in this movie. One is Jennifer Saunders, who plays the LAPD counselor Dr. Alex Kular. Yes, that's really her name, and that kind of gives you a hint on the role she plays within the story, but we won't get into that for spoiler purposes. And the other being Paul Whitehouse, who plays Steele's landlord, and a clown near the end of the movie. Again, won't be getting into that because it does also go into spoilers. They both do really good jobs, Saunders in particular because she does have a pedigree in voicing villains in animated movies. Her voice is definitely a lot more sophisticated and even slightly sultrier compared to her fairy godmother voice from Shrek 2, and it really works. Paul Whitehouse, while he does do a great job, it does kind of feel pointless that he's even in there because he's only got like 5 lines throughout the whole movie. I appreciate that they got him in there, and I always like his voice acting work, but yeah, what was even the point of having him in there? Was he just walking by the set one day and Mike Mort went, "Hey, you want to be in our movie?" Alright. I just gotta say, "You goddamn pervert," right? Yeah, say that. Weird. But the big talking point about the movie is its animation. And all I can say is, wow. This is hands down the best stop motion animation I have ever seen. Way better than even Aardman or Leica, and that's saying a lot. It is unbelievably smooth and well crafted. It's almost hard to imagine that this was done in stop motion. You almost imagine it's CGI, but it's not. It's actually done with stop motion techniques. Part of the reason why it does look so good though is because it was done with a 24 frame per second camera as opposed to the standard 12 that's normally used for stop motion. And I know that doesn't sound like much, but anybody who's done stop motion, I've even dabbled in a little bit of that, knows that the more frames per second that you add into a camera when you're doing it, it can expose the flaws of what you're doing a lot easier, so it makes the movement potentially a little bit more harder to capture, and it means that everything has to be fine-tuned unbelievably well, otherwise it won't look good at all. And they pulled it off. This movie looks unbelievable. It is by far the best stop motion animation I have ever seen. And not even just in terms of the fluidity and the motion, but also the way in which the models are designed are unbelievably well done, as well as the miniatures and the props. They look really, really well detailed. And just the sheer amount of things that are happening on screen at once makes this look like it was unbelievably difficult to do, but my god, did they pull it off. I really give them props for this. This is an unbelievably ambitious project, especially for an independent movie, and it passed with flying colours. My god, this just looks incredible. There's a little bit of CGI in there for some of the more digital or ambitious effects, but they really only use that for the action scenes or for the things that they really couldn't pull off with stop motion, so I'm not going to give them any kind of shit for that. And honestly, for the most part, you don't even notice because it just looks so damn entertaining to watch. The only issue I do have is that because the movement had to be very fluid and because they were doing it in 24 frames per second, it means that they're not allowed to get that exaggerated with what the models and characters can do, which is surprising because if you've seen GOGS, they had some very cartoony moments in that. But yeah, they definitely had these guys move in a more semi-realistic style, which I get that that was kind of the limitation, but it does kind of make you wish that they went a bit more exaggerated with it. Which, to be fair, they do during the climax, but you do kind of wish that they could go a little bit further with it. But either way, you don't really notice that, and it's definitely the sort of style that they were going for with it being more semi-realistic, which means that when the silly stuff does happen, it makes it stand out all the more. Also, I want to say that the music for this movie is brilliant. It's basically a mixture of actual 80s glam metal and hair metal ballads, and they fit perfectly, and there's a bunch of them in there that I wasn't even aware of, and I'm glad that I was made aware of them because they are awesome and I absolutely love listening to them, especially XYZ's Face Down in the Gutter and Night Moves. Those were really good songs. But they also include some songs from Saxon and Judas Priest, and including either of those bands are a good way to get on my side, so bravo there. Like I said though, this movie was not that very well received by the critics, and I think it was a mixture of the things that I mentioned, but also the very limited release made it seem like it was just something that kind of popped up out of nowhere. There wasn't really any hype made for it. So I think that's really a shame because, like I said, I think this movie's amazing. I know that it's not exactly the most intelligent movie, but at the same time, like I said, it's not trying to be. It's just trying to be entertaining, and while yes, I can understand the fact that they went this ambitious for a script and story that is this silly, does seem like a bit of a weird contrast, but me personally, I think it works, and it's clearly not trying to be that intelligent or witty or deep, it's just trying to entertain you. And if they want to go all out with it, then they might as well. And in a way, that actually fits perfectly with the 80s action movies because they were very ambitious and they were very over the top, but they also had very stupid scripts, but they were still entertaining. So this matches perfectly, really. So I really recommend you check this movie out. And you may just get a chance very soon. Next Wednesday night on my Discord, we are streaming this movie all the way through. So, if you want to check it out, come along. But let's see what I shove my steak into next time.